May 1536, the Tower of London. 5 men were sentenced to death. They were accused of a crime that paralyzed the English court and shocked all of Europe, committing high treason by committing adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. Among them was Sir William Brereton, who was not a young lover, but a 50-year-old political boss possessing a massive fortune. Adding his name to the Queen's list of lovers was not about protecting royal honor. It was simply the fastest way for King Henry VIII to steal his wealth. In the end, this powerful boss did not die for his actual crimes, but was executed simply because King Henry VIII completely invented a fake sexual scandal to kill him. He was born sometime between 1487 and 1490 into a highly respected, deeply entrenched gentry family in Cheshire. Located in the northwest of England, sharing a volatile border with Wales, Cheshire was not a standard English county. It was a county palatine. This designation gave Cheshire a semi-independent legal status. The standard legal system administered from London did not fully apply there. Cheshire had its own independent administration. It operated its own courts known as the Exchequer of Chester. It had a fierce, centuries-old tradition of local autonomy. For the central authorities sitting in London, Cheshire was notoriously difficult to monitor and almost impossible to govern directly. It was a region where local strongmen held the real authority. The Brereton family was a cornerstone of this regional power structure. William's father, Sir Randall Brereton of Malpas and Shocklack, was a man of serious military and political weight. Sir Randall was a knight of the body to King Henry VII. He was a decorated soldier who fought fiercely in the French campaigns of 1513. For his service, he was granted the highly lucrative position of Chamberlain of Chester. The Breretons were wealthy, well-connected, and deeply feared in the Northwest. However, William was born with a severe, unchangeable disadvantage. He was the 6th or possibly the 7th son in the family. In Tudor England, the economy, the social order, and political power were entirely dictated by land. The ownership and transfer of land were governed by a strict legal doctrine, the law of primogeniture. Primogeniture meant that upon a father's death, the eldest surviving son inherited absolutely everything: the ancestral home, the vast farming estates, the core titles, and the generational wealth went entirely to the firstborn. This system was designed to keep aristocratic estates intact, ensuring that prominent families could provide taxes and military levies to the crown without their wealth being diluted. For younger sons, this system was devastating. They were left completely exposed to the elements of the Tudor economy. A younger son might receive a meager financial allowance. He might be given a small, unexceptional parcel of land. Mostly he received his family name and the expectation that he would fend for himself. For William Brereton, this lack of inheritance was not just a disappointment. It was a crisis of survival. He was born into a world of immense visible privilege. He grew up in grand manor houses and watched his father wield real power. Yet William personally possessed none of that capital. Stripped of an automatic birthright, Brereton realized early on that if he wanted to maintain the high-status lifestyle of his class, he could not sit in Cheshire and wait for wealth to come to him. He had to actively take it, and to take it, he had to go directly to the source of all wealth in the 16th century, the royal court. Brereton recognized that political leverage was the most efficient tool for generating personal wealth. He needed to get close to the king. He leveraged his father's established military and political connections in London. In the early 1520s, William, along with 3 of his brothers, secured minor entry-level positions serving the royal household of King Henry VIII. The Tudor court was a highly competitive, dangerous environment. It was packed with ambitious men trying to catch the king's eye. Brereton proved himself to be a capable, reliable, and highly observant servant. He did not waste his time writing poetry or engaging in courtly romances. He focused on administration, logistics, and understanding the complex social dynamics of the palace. He learned who held the power, how money flowed, and what the king valued in a servant. In 1524, his patience and quiet networking paid off. He achieved the political breakthrough that would define the rest of his career. William Brereton was officially appointed as a Groom of the Privy Chamber. To a modern ear, the title Groom sounds like a glorified servant. It implies someone who looked after the horses or cleaned the fireplaces. In the political reality of the 1520s, it was roughly the equivalent of being the White House Chief of Staff. The Tudor court was a massive, sprawling public arena. Thousands of people, foreign diplomats, high-ranking nobles, desperate petitioners, and domestic servants crowded the outer halls of palaces like Whitehall and Hampton Court. It was loud, chaotic, and highly public. But the Privy Chamber was different. It was the king's private sanctuary. It was the absolute nerve center of the English government. Brereton's new job was intensely physically personal. He was one of a highly select group of men permitted inside this inner sanctum. He woke King Henry VIII in the morning. He helped him dress. He managed the king's personal schedule. He stood silently by the king's side during his most private, unguarded moments. By performing these intimate tasks, Brereton gained the most valuable currency in 16th century politics, a monopoly of access. In a system where the king's personal whim was the absolute law of the land, physical access to the king was everything. The government did not operate through independent agencies. It operated through royal favor. Every duke, earl, bishop, and foreign ambassador who wanted a political favor, a legal pardon, or a lucrative land grant had to get through the men guarding the doors of the Privy Chamber. Brereton quickly and quietly turned his physical proximity to Henry VIII into a highly profitable political toll booth. He controlled the flow of information to the monarch. If a regional rival in Cheshire sent a petition to the king, Brereton could ensure it was delayed or lost. He could quietly whisper in Henry's ear while dressing him, casually destroying a man's reputation. He could suggest an ally for a vacant administrative position. Most importantly, he enjoyed the king's absolute unwavering favor. Henry VIII liked Brereton. He trusted his pragmatic, unsentimental approach to problem solving. With this ultimate shield of royal protection firmly in place, Brereton had acquired the leverage he needed. He was no longer just a landless younger son. He was the gatekeeper to the king. Now he turned his eyes back to his home in the northwest. It was time to build his empire. William Brereton had successfully infiltrated the very center of the English government. As a groom of the Privy Chamber, he held the ear of King Henry VIII. He had the power to block petitions, secure royal pardons, and direct the flow of state patronage. But Brereton was a pragmatist. He understood that court favor was notoriously volatile. Kings change their minds. Factions rise and fall. To secure permanent, unassailable wealth, Brereton needed to convert his political influence in London into hard, physical assets on the ground. He turned his attention back to the semi-independent County Palatine of Cheshire. He began to construct a localized, deeply corrupt shadow empire, utilizing the legal mechanisms of the Tudor state as his personal weapons. The foundation of Brereton's regional empire was laid through a highly calculated marriage. Around 1529, he married Lady Elizabeth Somerset. On the surface, it was a brilliant social match. Lady Elizabeth was the daughter of Charles Somerset, the first Earl of Worcester. This made her a second cousin to King Henry VIII himself. Marrying into this bloodline elevated Brereton, the landless younger son, into the highest echelons of the English aristocracy. However, Brereton was not driven by romance or mere social prestige. He was driven by the acquisition of land and capital. Lady Elizabeth was a wealthy widow. Her previous husband, Sir John Savage, had been a massive landowner in Cheshire, but his life had ended in severe legal and financial ruin. Sir John Savage had been heavily embroiled in local gang violence and had been charged with murder. Because of these severe crimes against the king's peace, the vast Savage family estates had been effectively frozen. The properties were taken into royal custody by the state. Sir John Savage died while heavily in debt to the crown, leaving behind a young, underage heir. In the Tudor legal system, this situation triggered a mechanism known as wardship. Wardship was one of the most lucrative, highly contested, and frequently abused financial systems in 16th century England. When a wealthy landowner died leaving an underage heir, the crown automatically assumed legal guardianship of both the child and the land. The crown, recognizing that it did not have the bureaucratic manpower to manage thousands of farms across the country, would then sell this wardship to a loyal courtier or a high bidder. The purchaser of the wardship gained the absolute legal right to manage the estates, exploit their natural resources, collect all the rents, and pocket the profits until the child reached the age of majority, usually 21 for men. The guardian was also granted the legal right to arrange the child's future marriage, often selling that marriage to the highest bidder. Through his marriage to the widowed Lady Elizabeth, and by heavily leveraging his daily intimate access to King Henry VIII in the Privy Chamber, William Brereton secured the wardship of the Savage estates. He acquired it for a fraction of its true value. Overnight, the massive rolling revenues of the Savage family lands were diverted straight into Brereton's personal treasury. He aggressively stripped the estates of their profits, extracting maximum revenue while the heir was legally powerless. This massive, sudden influx of capital provided Brereton with the exact financial foundation he needed to fund the next, far more aggressive phase of his operation. The web of offices institutionalizing extortion, Brereton did not attempt to rule Cheshire and the Welsh Marches through a single highly visible title like an earldom. He understood that true power at the regional level was administrative. He ruled through a complex overlapping web of local bureaucratic offices. He practiced a system known as pluralism. This involved aggressively hoarding multiple government positions at the same time. By doing this, Brereton controlled every single lever of local power. He effectively built a 16th century organized crime syndicate, fully subsidized by the state. His power base started as the Chamberlain of Chester, a role he inherited from his father. This position made him the chief financial officer, granting him total control over the regional treasury, tax collection, and state funds. Brereton also expanded his reach into military and territorial domains. He became the constable of massive military strongholds on the Welsh borders, notably Holt and Chirk castles. These were highly strategic rather than ceremonial positions. They gave him direct command over armed professional garrisons. Additionally, he served as the steward of the surrounding lordships. This gave him the legal authority to extract rents, impose heavy fines, and demand labor from thousands of local tenant farmers. To protect his network, Brereton took over the local justice system. As Sheriff of Flint and Merioneth, he held supreme law enforcement power. He controlled the courts, managed the jails, and carefully selected the juries. This ensured that no local landowner could ever successfully sue him or his men. He also held his most easily weaponized office as the Escheator of Cheshire. In this role, he investigated deceased landowners to seize their properties for the crown, often exploiting inheritance rules or unpaid debts. Brereton weaponized the office of Escheator. He used it to launch bogus legal investigations against neighboring landowners. He would threaten to seize their ancestral lands on behalf of the king unless they paid him exorbitant personal bribes. He systematically used this legal threat to annex vulnerable lands into his own expanding portfolio. History often remembers the Tudor era for the glittering pageantry of the royal court, the philosophical debates of the Reformation, and the fine tapestries of Hampton Court Palace. But daily life under William Brereton's rule in Cheshire and the Welsh borders was governed by raw physical intimidation. He maintained a massive private army stationed primarily at Holt Castle. These men were known as retainers. They were a private militia who wore Brereton's family badge, known as a livery. Under the guise of maintaining the king's peace on the volatile Welsh border, these retainers functioned as an organized gang of enforcers. They rode through the countryside heavily armed. They intimidated small landowners, squashed local political dissent, forcefully collected extortion money, and ensured Brereton's will was carried out without question. If a local farmer disputed a land boundary with Brereton, the retainers would arrive to forcefully evict the family. His annual income skyrocketed due to this combination of legal extortion, wardship stripping, and administrative hoarding. Historical financial records suggest he was bringing in an immense fortune, making him one of the wealthiest men in the country outside the high nobility. He had vaulted from a penniless younger son to the absolute apex of the regional elite. His grip on the region became so complete and his control over the local justice system so absolute that Brereton and his men could literally murder their rivals with complete impunity. This brutal reality is perfectly illustrated by the chilling case of John ap Griffith Ayton. Ayton was a prominent local Welsh gentleman who clashed politically and financially with the Brereton faction. In 1535, the dispute reached a boiling point. Brereton's retainers ambushed Ayton and simply murdered him in cold blood. In a functioning legal system, the murderers would be arrested and tried for homicide. The local authorities did initially attempt to intervene and hold Brereton's men accountable, but Brereton immediately stepped in. He used his immense power as sheriff and his influence as chamberlain to entirely manipulate the local justice system. He actively intimidated the local judges. He heavily packed the jury with his own loyal retainers and debtors. He then went a step further, demonstrating a terrifying, highly calculated use of state power. Brereton ordered the arrest of the victims' allies. He locked Ayton's supporters in the deep dungeons of Holt Castle, accusing them of inciting a riot. In a staggering display of legal manipulation, Brereton managed to turn the tables entirely. The murderers walked free, and several of the victims' supporters were blamed for the unrest, convicted in Brereton's courts, and hanged. When desperate, terrified local families tried to bypass Brereton's regional stranglehold and appeal directly to the highest courts in London, such as the Star Chamber or the King's Bench, they found themselves hitting an impenetrable brick wall. Brereton had engineered a perfect closed loop of corruption. If a legal complaint against his extortion reached London, Brereton would simply retreat to the safety of the privy chamber. He would utilize his daily intimate access to King Henry VIII. He would whisper to the king that the complaints were merely the grumblings of disloyal, rebellious Welshmen who resented the king's authority. Relying on his personal charm and the king's trust, Brereton would easily secure a quiet, royal pardon for whatever violent or corrupt act his men had committed. He would then ride back to Cheshire armed with a document bearing the king's own seal, completely untouchable. He was the law, he was the judge, and he was the executioner. Sir William Brereton had successfully built a self-sustaining, violently enforced monopoly on power in the Northwest, but his untouchable status was operating on borrowed time. The political landscape of England was shifting rapidly beneath his feet. By the mid-1530s, Brereton's localized feudal shadow empire was on a direct collision course with a force even more ruthless and far more systematically organized than himself. That force was King Henry VIII's new chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, and Cromwell was about to initiate the greatest centralization of state power in English history. By the mid-1530s, Sir William Brereton had reached the absolute zenith of his power. He controlled the courts, the taxes, and the military fortresses of the Northwest. He operated with absolute impunity, shielded by his immense wealth and his daily access to King Henry VIII. However, while Brereton was busy counting his extorted coin in Cheshire, the entire political architecture of England was undergoing a violent, radical transformation. The Tudor state was modernizing, and it was doing so under the direction of a man who was every bit as ruthless as Brereton, but infinitely more systematic. Thomas Cromwell was the king's new chief minister. He was a brilliant, unsentimental, and highly efficient bureaucrat. Unlike the noblemen of the traditional aristocracy who relied on inherited titles, Cromwell was a self-made man, a former mercenary and merchant who had risen to power through sheer administrative genius and a brutal willingness to execute the king's will. Cromwell's ultimate political goal was absolute centralization. He envisioned a modern, streamlined English state where all power, all law, and all money flowed directly to London and specifically to the king. To achieve this, Cromwell recognized that the old fragmented feudal system had to be destroyed. He was actively drafting monumental legislation known as the Laws in Wales Acts. This sweeping legal reform was designed to wipe out the local autonomy of the border regions, dismantle the old power bases of the Marcher Lords, and impose London's courts, London's laws, and London's taxes across the entire western frontier. When Cromwell looked at the map of England, Sir William Brereton was the ultimate obstacle. Brereton, with his massive private army at Holt Castle, his rigged regional juries, and his ironclad stranglehold on northwestern tax revenues, was a dangerous relic of feudal warlordism. He was a regional kingpin operating within a nation that Cromwell was desperately trying to unify under one absolute monarch. Cromwell's desire to eliminate Brereton was not purely ideological. It was also driven by intense, immediate financial desperation. King Henry VIII had recently made the most catastrophic geopolitical decision in English history. Driven by his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, Henry had officially broken England's ties with the Catholic Church in Rome. This decision left England politically and religiously isolated in Europe. Henry faced the constant, terrifying threat of a joint foreign invasion from the massive Catholic superpowers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. To defend the island, Henry desperately needed to build a massive network of coastal fortresses and expand the Royal Navy. Building castles and fighting wars required vast sums of money, and the royal treasury was rapidly depleting. The crown was hemorrhaging cash. Thomas Cromwell and the king looked at Sir William Brereton's immense, ill-gotten wealth with deep, calculated envy. Brereton was sitting on a mountain of extorted gold, lucrative wardships, and thousands of acres of highly profitable land. Cromwell realized that if he could break Brereton, he could absorb that entire regional empire directly into the national treasury. But Cromwell faced a serious, incredibly frustrating legal problem. Sir William Brereton was a master of exploiting the English legal system. He could not be easily arrested or convicted using standard criminal law. If Cromwell attempted to charge Brereton with extortion, corruption, or even murder, and tried the case in Cheshire, it would be a humiliating failure. Brereton controlled the regional sheriffs. He would simply bribe or violently threaten the local jury, securing an immediate acquittal, just as he had done a dozen times before. If Cromwell managed to bypass the local courts and tried Brereton in London for his financial crimes, the standard punishment under common law was merely a heavy fine, not death. Brereton was a multimillionaire. In modern terms, he could easily pay the fine. Or worse, Brereton could simply utilize his position in the Privy Chamber, talk directly to King Henry VIII, and secure a royal pardon. To break Brereton completely, to permanently remove him from the political board and seize his assets, Cromwell needed a highly specific type of crime. He needed a charge that carried an unavoidable death penalty. He needed a charge that legally prevented the king from issuing a casual pardon. Most importantly, he needed a charge that automatically triggered the total irreversible confiscation of all the accused's property. He found his ultimate weapon in the newly minted Treason Act of 1534. The Treason Act of 1534 was a terrifying piece of legislation designed by Cromwell to crush any domestic opposition to the king's break with Rome. It radically expanded the definition of what constituted treason against the state. Under this new legal framework, a conviction for high treason carried a horrific, sweeping legal consequence known as the corruption of blood. This was the exact mechanism Cromwell needed. If a man was convicted of high treason, he was immediately stripped of all civil rights. His bloodline was legally tainted. He could not pass down his wealth or his titles to his heirs. Every single acre of land, every hidden chest of gold, every lucrative government office, and every wardship he controlled was instantly and entirely forfeited to the crown. His wife and children would be evicted from their homes, left completely destitute and legally ruined. Cromwell had the legal weapon. Now he just needed an excuse to use it. That excuse presented itself in the chaotic bloody spring of 1536. In May 1536, the political landscape of the Tudor court shifted violently. Queen Anne Boleyn's political faction collapsed. She had failed to provide King Henry VIII with a living male heir, delivering only a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, and suffering several devastating miscarriages. Henry, desperate for a son and already infatuated with Jane Seymour, decided he was finished with Anne. Thomas Cromwell moved swiftly and ruthlessly to engineer the Queen's destruction. He needed to provide the king with a legally airtight, publicly justifiable reason for a divorce and an execution. Cromwell launched a highly secretive, rapid-fire investigation, gathering a list of men to accuse of being the Queen's secret lovers. Among the predictable list of handsome, cultured courtiers, poets, and musicians who surrounded the Queen, Cromwell quietly, deliberately inserted the name of the aging, pragmatic mafia boss of Cheshire, Sir William Brereton. This is where the political genius of the Tudor state reveals its darkest, most pragmatic nature. Under Tudor law, sleeping with the Queen was not just a moral failing, a religious sin, or simple adultery, because it threatened the absolute legitimacy of the royal bloodline and the national succession. Cuckolding the king was classified as high treason. By adding Brereton's name to the list of the Queen's lovers, Cromwell solved all of his political and financial problems with a single stroke of the pen. The inclusion of Sir William Brereton on the list of Queen Anne Boleyn's lovers is one of the most glaring, deliberate anomalies in English legal history. Modern historians universally agree that the accusation was entirely fabricated. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, did not care about the truth. He cared about eliminating a political obstacle and seizing a massive regional fortune. To execute this theft legally, Cromwell had to construct a narrative of treason. But when we examine the actual evidence presented by the Tudor state, the sheer absurdity of the charges against Brereton becomes undeniably clear. First, there was a massive fundamental mismatch in personality and courtly culture. Queen Anne Boleyn's inner circle was highly exclusive. It was heavily influenced by the French Renaissance. The men who populated her private chambers were young, highly educated, and culturally refined. They spoke fluent French. They wrote romantic poetry. They were skilled musicians and elegant dancers. They engaged in the elaborate, highly stylized game of courtly love. Sir William Brereton was none of these things. He was a man approaching 50 years of age. He was a hardened, coarse, and deeply pragmatic political operator. His daily life was consumed with calculating tax revenues, commanding military garrisons, and orchestrating violent land grabs on the Welsh borders. He had absolutely no place within the refined, highly cultured, and youthful circle of the Queen. The idea that Anne Boleyn would risk her crown and her life to conduct a secret, passionate affair with an aging, ruthless regional administrator defies basic logic. More importantly, the state's case completely collapsed under the weight of basic logistics. Brereton possessed an ironclad, geographically proven alibi. The official government indictment, the legal document that would ultimately send him to his death, claimed that Brereton had engaged in illicit sexual relations with the Queen at Hampton Court Palace in November and December of 1533. However, surviving administrative records and financial ledgers from the period clearly prove that this timeline was a physical impossibility. During those exact weeks in late 1533, Queen Anne Boleyn was in strict, heavily guarded confinement following the birth of her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. She was surrounded entirely by her female attendants. Furthermore, historical records place Sir William Brereton hundreds of miles away during this exact period. He was deeply entrenched in Wales and Cheshire, actively commanding his troops, managing his estates, and collecting regional taxes for the crown. The dates in the indictment were wrong. The geography was wrong. The personal motive was entirely missing. But in the volatile spring of 1536, empirical facts did not matter in Thomas Cromwell's court. The trap was meticulously set, and the lethal machinery of the Tudor justice system was already in motion. Cromwell knew he was dealing with a highly dangerous adversary. If Brereton had received even a single day of advance warning regarding the charges, the situation could have spiraled into a national crisis. Had Brereton suspected an arrest, he would have immediately fled London. He would have ridden hard for Cheshire, barricaded himself behind the massive stone walls of Holt Castle, and mobilized his private army of retainers. He could have forced King Henry VIII into a highly costly, embarrassing, and prolonged regional civil war. To prevent this, Cromwell executed a perfect, flawlessly timed cold arrest. On the morning of May 4th, 1536, Sir William Brereton was attending court at Whitehall Palace in London, conducting his standard duties as a groom of the Privy Chamber. He was detained completely by surprise. Before he could send a messenger to his allies or attempt an escape, he was immediately stripped of his weapons, thrown onto a guarded barge on the River Thames, and transported directly to the Tower of London. This single rapid administrative move was fatal. It physically severed Brereton from his entire power base. Cut off from his Cheshire army, his network of bribed judges, and his heavily fortified border castles, his massive wealth became entirely useless. In the span of a few hours, the untouchable mafia boss of the Northwest was reduced to an aging man in a damp stone cell, facing the full, terrifying weight of the centralized government. On May 12, 1536, Sir William Brereton was brought to trial at Westminster Hall alongside the other accused men. This proceeding was not a trial designed to uncover the truth, weigh evidence, or administer justice. It was pure judicial theater. It was a kangaroo court, orchestrated specifically to deliver a predetermined verdict of death. Under the brutal, heavily weighted statutes of Tudor treason law, the legal system was designed to crush the defendant. The concept of innocent until proven guilty did not exist. Brereton was entirely stripped of his right to legal counsel. He had to defend himself against the finest legal minds of the crown. He was barred from seeing the specific evidence or the witness testimonies against him before the trial began, preventing him from preparing a coherent defense. Crucially, he was not permitted to call his own witnesses to corroborate his alibi and prove he was in Wales in 1533. But the most chilling aspect of the trial was the jury. Brereton stood before a jury that was entirely handpicked and heavily managed by Thomas Cromwell. To absolutely guarantee that there would be no sympathetic holdouts or unexpected acquittals, Cromwell made a highly calculated, deeply cynical choice for the jury foreman. He appointed a prominent gentleman named Edward Willoughby. The conflict of interest was staggering. Edward Willoughby was deeply, perhaps ruinously, in debt to Sir William Brereton. The arrangement was silently understood by every political operator in the courtroom. The moment Willoughby stood up and declared Brereton guilty of high treason, the legal mechanism of corruption of blood would activate. Brereton's massive estate would be immediately seized by the crown, and Willoughby's crippling financial debt to the dead man would legally cease to exist. Willoughby was effectively bribed with his own financial salvation to deliver a guilty verdict. Despite Brereton pleading his absolute innocence to the charges, and despite the obvious glaring geographical flaws in the Crown's timeline, the outcome was inevitable. The jury found him guilty. Brereton was condemned to death. The initial sentence handed down by the judges was the traditional, agonizingly slow punishment reserved for traitors to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. However, King Henry VIII, eager to expedite the executions and immediately begin absorbing Brereton's immense regional wealth, commuted the sentence to a simple beheading by the axe. On the morning of May 17, 1536, Sir William Brereton walked out of the Tower of London and climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold at Tower Hill. The protocol for Tudor executions was incredibly strict. Condemned men and women were expected to deliver standard, highly formulaic final speeches to the gathered crowd. They were supposed to confess to being generally sinful, acknowledge the absolute justice of the king's law, and praise Henry VIII's supposed mercy. It was a final act of public submission to the state, largely designed to protect their surviving family members from further royal anger and financial ruin. The other men who died beside him that day largely followed this established script. But Brereton, ever the hardened, cynical pragmatist, refused to play the victim. He delivered a sharp, carefully worded final statement that broke the mold and secured his place in history. Looking out at the silent, expectant crowd, Brereton loudly declared, "I have deserved to die if it were 1,000 deaths, but the cause wherefore I die, judge not." It remains one of the most brilliant, densely layered pieces of political rhetoric ever spoken on an English scaffold. With his dying breath, Brereton admitted to the brutal reality of his life. He was publicly acknowledging the years of extortion, the aggressive land theft, the rigged regional trials, and the blood his private army had spilled in Cheshire. He knew exactly what kind of man he was. He operated completely outside the bounds of traditional morality, and he conceded that his soul carried the heavy weight of 1,000 legitimate crimes. But by explicitly telling the crowd the cause wherefore I die, judge not, he was firmly, categorically, and publicly rejecting Thomas Cromwell's fabricated treason charge. He was telling the citizens of London and the historians who would later record his words, "I am a guilty, violent man, but I am entirely innocent of this specific crime. I never touched the Queen." The executioner stepped forward and swung the heavy axe. Sir William Brereton was decapitated. The moment Brereton's head fell onto the wooden planks, the true motive of the entire elaborate trial was instantly laid bare. Even before Brereton's body was placed into a simple wooden coffin to be buried within the walls of the tower, royal commissioners dispatched by Thomas Cromwell were already galloping at full speed toward the northwest. Blood was the necessary seal that activated the attainder. The financial purge in Cheshire was total, systematic, and immediate. The Crown seized military control of Holt Castle and Chirk Castle, permanently disbanding Brereton's private army. State auditors confiscated his hidden chests of extorted gold and silver. The government absorbed his thousands of acres of prime agricultural land. They seized the highly lucrative wardships he had stolen, including the massive Savage family estates. His wife, Lady Elizabeth, who steadfastly maintained her husband's absolute innocence regarding the Queen until the day she died, was legally stripped of her wealth and evicted from her homes. King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell had successfully executed one of the most massive, highly coordinated state-sanctioned land grabs ever witnessed in English history. They accomplished this staggering theft all under the convenient, morally righteous guise of protecting the honor of the royal marriage. The death of William Brereton left a massive power vacuum in the northwest. Cromwell immediately filled this void with loyal bureaucrats and royal officials who answered directly to London, not to local warlords. Without Brereton's formidable political machine to block it, the Laws in Wales Acts passed smoothly. The old independent network of border warlords was permanently, violently broken. The modern centralized English state had arrived. The execution of Sir William Brereton stands as the absolute pinnacle of Tudor statecraft. It reveals a government operating with cold, terrifying efficiency. Brereton was not crushed because he betrayed the king's marriage. He was crushed because his localized wealth and his untouchable regional power stood directly in the path of a monarch who demanded absolute centralized authority. Brereton lived his entire life aggressively exploiting the loopholes, the geography, and the corruption of the English legal system. In the end, he was destroyed by a state that simply rewrote the rules to ensure he could not win. He was a ruthless man, but his death reminds us of a chilling, enduring historical truth. In the highest halls of absolute power, morality is entirely irrelevant. The law is not a shield designed to protect the innocent. It is merely a weapon wielded with devastating precision by those who write it. The axe that severed Sir William Brereton's head on May 17th, 1536, did more than execute a single corrupt official. It acted as the starting gun for one of the most aggressive administrative takeovers in English history. With the regional warlord permanently removed, the Tudor state machinery, directed by Chief Minister Thomas Cromwell, descended upon the northwest of England with terrifying speed and efficiency. The aftermath of Brereton's death reveals the true cold-blooded pragmatism of the centralized government. The moment the guilty verdict of high treason was delivered, the legal doctrine of corruption of blood took immediate effect. Sir William Brereton legally ceased to exist as a property owner. To the Crown's auditors, his vast, carefully constructed empire was now simply a ledger of state assets to be liquidated. Royal commissioners were dispatched to Cheshire and the Welsh borders before Brereton was even buried. Their orders were absolute: secure the physical fortresses, seize all financial records, and confiscate every piece of valuable property. Holt Castle, the military heart of Brereton's operation was occupied by royal troops. The massive private army of retainers that had terrorized the region for a decade was immediately disbanded and outlawed. For Brereton's family, the political fallout was devastating. His wife, Lady Elizabeth Somerset, went from being one of the wealthiest and most highly connected women in the region to a destitute outcast overnight. Because of the attainder, she was legally stripped of her right to inherit her husband's wealth. Furthermore, the crown immediately seized the lucrative wardship of the Savage family estates, the very properties Elizabeth had brought into the marriage. Lady Elizabeth was physically evicted from her primary residences. Despite the overwhelming power of the state that had just murdered her husband, she displayed remarkable resilience. She spent the remaining years of her life fiercely, stubbornly petitioning the crown. She fought a relentless legal battle to reclaim at least a fraction of her original jointure, the property she owned prior to marrying Brereton, to survive. Interestingly, until her death in 1545, Lady Elizabeth never accepted the state's narrative. She maintained her husband's absolute innocence regarding the adultery charges with Queen Anne Boleyn. She left explicit instructions in her will to be buried alongside him, a quiet but profound final act of defiance against Thomas Cromwell's fabricated history. With the regional warlord's localized power base utterly obliterated and permanently dismantled, Cromwell's ambitious vision for a centralized, modern English state faced absolutely no further resistance in the Northwest. The political vacuum left by Brereton was immediately filled by men fundamentally different from the dead warlord. Cromwell did not install another powerful, independent noble in Cheshire. Instead, he appointed loyal, salaried bureaucrats, lawyers, and administrators who answered directly and exclusively to the government in London. The autonomy of the County Palatine of Cheshire was systematically dismantled. The laws in Wales Acts, often referred to as the Acts of Union, were pushed forward without opposition. These sweeping legislative acts fundamentally erased the old feudal boundaries. They formally annexed Wales into the Kingdom of England, imposed the English common law system across the entire western border, and mandated that all legal proceedings be conducted in the English language. The wild, heavily militarized Marcher lordships, the environment that had allowed a man like Brereton to operate a violent extortion ring with impunity, were abolished entirely. The region was divided into standard English counties, each governed by centrally appointed justices of the peace. The era of the regional Tudor warlord was officially over. The era of the centralized bureaucrat had begun. The destruction of Sir William Brereton was a masterpiece of political engineering. Thomas Cromwell had successfully utilized the Treason Act of 1534 to eliminate a massive obstacle, enrich the king, and modernize the state. He had weaponized the law with devastating precision. However, the political environment of King Henry VIII's court was inherently unstable, driven entirely by the paranoia and shifting affections of an absolute monarch. The very legal mechanisms that Cromwell had designed, refined, and deployed to destroy men like Brereton would eventually be turned directly against him. Just 4 years after Brereton's execution, Thomas Cromwell's own political faction collapsed following the disastrous brief marriage of Henry VIII to Anne of Cleves, a match arranged entirely by Cromwell. The chief minister lost the king's favor. The conservative aristocratic faction at court, led by the powerful Howard family, recognized their moment and struck with ruthless efficiency. In June 1540, Thomas Cromwell experienced the exact same terrifying sudden reality he had inflicted upon William Brereton. Cromwell was subjected to a cold arrest during a Privy Council meeting at Westminster. He was stripped of his offices, arrested without warning, and thrown into the Tower of London. The irony of Cromwell's demise is profound. His enemies did not attempt to charge him with standard crimes in a common law court, where his brilliant legal mind might have saved him. Instead, they used the exact same legislative weapon he had perfected, the Act of Attainder. Cromwell was condemned to death by an act of Parliament without a trial. He was denied the right to present evidence, cross-examine witnesses, or offer a legal defense. He was accused of treason and heresy based on fabricated evidence and forced testimonies. The man who had written the rules of Tudor state terror was crushed by his own machine. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill, the same execution site where William Brereton had died 4 years earlier. The intertwined fates of Sir William Brereton and Thomas Cromwell highlight the brutal, unforgiving nature of 16th century statecraft. Historically, William Brereton has often been reduced to a mere footnote, an unexplainable anomaly on the list of men executed alongside Queen Anne Boleyn. Romanticized histories of the Tudor era tend to focus on the poetry of Thomas Wyatt, the charm of Henry Norris, or the tragic innocence of the Queen herself. But stripped of the romantic mythology, the execution of William Brereton represents one of the most critical turning points in English domestic policy. He was not a collateral victim of a royal divorce. He was the primary target of a targeted, highly successful government heist. Brereton's death signaled the final violent transition from the medieval fragmented world of powerful local barons to the early modern reality of a centralized sovereign state. The Tudor government had definitively drawn a permanent line in the sand. Absolute sovereignty belonged to London alone, and any lingering regional autonomy would be ruthlessly crushed at the sharp edge of the executioner's axe. Brereton played the lethal game of Tudor politics with exceptional skill, utilizing bribery, violence, and royal favor to build a staggering personal empire. But he failed to realize that the rules of the game were being fundamentally rewritten by men in London. When absolute power demands conformity and capital, no localized army, no network of bribed judges, and no amount of extorted gold can stop the machinery of the state once it begins to move. The violent executions of Sir William Brereton in 1536 and his destroyer Thomas Cromwell in 1540 left the political landscape of England fundamentally altered. The era of the untouchable regional warlord and the brilliant, omnipotent chief minister had ended in identical pools of blood on Tower Hill. But the true legacy of this brutal power struggle was not found in the severed heads mounted on London Bridge. It was found in the silent, terrifyingly efficient, bureaucratic machinery that continued to hum long after the men who built it were dead. Following the massive government heist of 1536, the Crown's primary objective was the total eradication of William Brereton's localized power base. However, Tudor statecraft, while brutal, was also highly pragmatic. The government did not systematically execute the entirety of the extended Brereton family. To do so would have sparked the very regional rebellion Cromwell had specifically engineered the cold arrest to avoid. Instead, the state engaged in a calculated policy of political castration. William's brothers, who had ridden his coattails into minor positions at court, were quietly purged from the privy chamber and stripped of their influence. They were allowed to live, but they were exiled back to the political wilderness of the Northwest, barred from the centers of national power. William's young son, Thomas Brereton, inherited a devastated legacy. Because of his father's attainder and the corruption of blood, Thomas was legally barred from inheriting the massive stolen wealth his father had accumulated. He did not inherit Holt Castle, the private armies, or the lucrative wardships. The boy was allowed to inherit only a fraction of the original, modest family lands that predated his father's extortion ring. The Cheshire Breretons survived, but they were permanently demoted. They transitioned from acting as sovereign, untouchable warlords to functioning merely as localized, obedient gentry. The name William Brereton became a whispered cautionary tale in the taverns of Chester, a dark reminder of what happens when a regional kingpin flies too close to the sun and challenges the absolute monopoly of the king's law. The Shadow Empire was gone. The ghost of Brereton lingered in the architecture of the border castles he once commanded. But the men guarding those walls now wore the livery of the king, not the badge of the mafia boss. The most profound historical irony of this entire saga lies in the aftermath of Thomas Cromwell's execution in 1540, when conservative aristocrats like the Duke of Norfolk finally managed to outmaneuver Cromwell and send him to the block. They believed they were turning back the clock. They assumed that by cutting off the head of the chief minister, they could dismantle the centralized modern state he had built and return to the old feudal days of aristocratic dominance. They were catastrophically mistaken. Thomas Cromwell's ultimate genius was that he did not build a system that relied on his personal existence to function. Unlike William Brereton, whose regional empire immediately collapsed the moment he was physically removed from Cheshire, Cromwell had built institutions. He had created the Privy Council, an organized, highly structured executive board that managed the daily affairs of the nation. He had established the Court of Augmentations, a massive, dedicated financial bureaucracy specifically designed to manage, audit, and funnel the wealth seized from attainted traders like Brereton, and the dissolved monasteries directly into the national treasury. When Cromwell died, the machinery simply kept grinding forward without him. The bureaucrats he trained, the legal precedents he established with the Treason Act, and the massive financial networks he built remained entirely intact. The conservatives who orchestrated his death suddenly found themselves trapped within the very administrative cage Cromwell had forged. The transition of power in England was complete. Authority was no longer derived from how many armed retainers a lord could physically muster in a courtyard. As Brereton had done, authority was now derived entirely from stamped paper, parliamentary statutes, and proximity to the administrative organs of the state in London. The impact of this centralized leviathan was felt most acutely in the very region William Brereton had once terrorized. The Laws in Wales Acts push through the vacuum created by Brereton's death successfully achieved their goal. The wild, lawless frontier of the Welsh Marches was systematically tamed. The autonomous power of the County Palatine of Cheshire was heavily diluted, subsumed into the national legal framework. The cultural shift in the Northwest was profound. For centuries, disputes in this region had been settled by blood feuds, private militias, and the violent intimidation of local juries. Under the new centralized Tudor regime, disputes were forced into the formalized, heavily regulated arena of the English common law courts. If a local landowner had a boundary dispute, he no longer hired a gang of armed thugs to evict his neighbor. He hired a lawyer in London to file a brief in the Court of Chancery. The physical violence of the frontier was replaced by the financial violence of litigation. It was slower, it was fiercely expensive, but it was entirely controlled by the crown. The Tudor state had successfully achieved a monopoly on violence. Extortion, land theft, and murder were no longer tolerated as the private enterprises of regional strongmen. If blood was to be spilled, or if wealth was to be confiscated, it would only be done legally, formally, and exclusively by the state itself. When we look back at the intertwined lives and horrific deaths of Sir William Brereton and Thomas Cromwell, we are forced to look into the dark, unvarnished mirror of state building. Brereton is easy to condemn. He was a corrupt, violent opportunist. He exploited the weak, rigged the courts, and hoarded wealth while operating under the hypocritical guise of maintaining the king's peace. He was a monster forged by the geographic isolation of his environment. But Cromwell presents a far more terrifying historical archetype. Cromwell was the architect of modern state terror. He utilized the law not as an instrument of objective justice, but as a surgical weapon of political extermination. He recognized that to build a unified, centralized nation, he had to completely eradicate local resistance. He fabricated evidence, manipulated juries, and weaponized the definition of treason to systematically murder his political rivals and seize their capital. Brereton broke the law to enrich himself. Cromwell rewrote the law to empower the state. Both men utilized terror, and both men ultimately had their heads separated from their bodies by the very system they sought to manipulate. The execution of Sir William Brereton on the fabricated charge of sleeping with Queen Anne Boleyn was not a tragedy of romance. It was a cold, calculated transaction of power. It stands as a chilling monument to the birth of the modern centralized government. The Tudor regime proved with devastating clarity that an absolute state cannot tolerate an absolute rival. Brereton's shadow empire in Cheshire was a tumor on the body politic of a kingdom attempting to unify. The crown acted as the surgeon, using the axe to cut the tumor out and absorb its nutrients. The story of the Tudor mafia boss reminds us that the foundations of modern legal and administrative systems are rarely built on noble ideals or philosophical enlightenment. They are almost always built on the graves of those who stood in the way of centralization, and they are cemented with the stolen wealth of the vanquished. The law prevailed in Cheshire, but it prevailed only because the government in London proved it could be infinitely more ruthless and far more organized than the warlord it replaced.